As I said, I'm Steve Seiger. I'm a co-founder here at CNOT, where we are working to make it meaningfully easier for organizations, companies to access affordable and high-quality carbon offsets. Although our customers run the gamut from ride sharing to sort of home construction, they have a core commonality, which is that they're committed to taking climate action, but they have limited in-house expertise on how to navigate the carbon market. So what we do with a few clicks is enable them to access science-backed, off-the-shelf offset strategy that enables them to affordably drive impact. One of the best parts of my job at CNOT is getting to know so many of the leading voices in the space. Three of the folks I've most enjoyed getting to know are here with us today. So let me just quickly introduce them. First, we have Derek Broekhoff, who's joining us from Seattle. Derek is currently a senior scientist at the Stockholm Environment Institute, a member of the expert panel of the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, the ICVCM. And we're fortunate to report an advisor to both CNOT and Calyx Global. He's also the co-author of the Offset Guide, which is the leading guide for using carbon offsets. And he previously oversaw development of the Climate Action Reserve's voluntary carbon offset program and its transition into California's regulatory cap and trade program. Next, we have from the mountains of Colorado, Donna Lee, a co-founder of Calyx Global, whose mission is to increase the impact of the voluntary carbon markets by providing information and ratings on the greenhouse gas integrity, sustainable development impact, and ESG risks of carbon offsets. Like Derek, Donna is a member of the expert panel of the ICVCM, and she's been working on climate for nearly 20 years since she began her career as a climate negotiator at the State Department. And lastly, we're thrilled to be joined by Taylor Wright, Executive Director of Operational Sustainability at JPMorgan Chase, who's calling in from Columbus, Ohio. The operational sustainability team at JPMorgan develops and executes the firm's strategy to minimize the environmental impact of its global operations and supply chain. And Taylor oversees the tracking and reporting of the firm's greenhouse gas emissions and progress towards operational sustainability targets. Most relevant for today, she's responsible for the firm-wide carbon portfolio strategy, including identifying, evaluating, and sourcing carbon credits to achieve the firm's sustainability goals. By any measure, JPMorgan is a large and sophisticated buyer of carbon offsets, and so we're fortunate to have the opportunity to learn from Taylor today. All right, so let's dive in. To make sure we're all starting from sort of the same place, some quick background that some of you most certainly know, but others may not. Today, we're talking about voluntary carbon offsets, which are distinct from credits bought in the compliance markets. Voluntary offsets are bought by obligations or individuals without a legal obligation to do so. So what is a carbon offset? It's a reduction or removal of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases that compensates for an equivalent emission somewhere else. So, for example, you emit some carbon dioxide here, someone else avoids emitting some there, and the two net out. To put it mildly, some organizations are not a fan. In just one blog post, for instance, Greenpeace called offsets a scammer's dream, the next big thing in greenwashing, a bookkeeping trick, a fraud, and a classic con. That's all within about 500 words. The folks on this panel obviously disagree with this take, and that doesn't mean they believe that offsets are the only solution to combating climate change, but they believe it's a key piece of the puzzle to keep temperatures below a critical level. I would add that McKinsey thinks this is going to go from a $2 billion market to a $50 billion market over the next 10 years. So it's increasingly important to be confident that offsets should be a piece of the climate puzzle. So I'd love to start with how each of you think about offsets and why you think they're an important part of the toolkit. Derek, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve. And thanks for the opportunity to be here. Yeah, I guess just big picture, right? Globally, we are failing to address climate change rapidly enough. And more specifically, for years now, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, developed countries have been committing to provide climate finance, that is finance for mitigation and adaptation around the world in developing countries, and have committed to upping those levels of climate finance at the same time as they've been falling short of meeting those commitments. So we're not doing nearly enough to address climate change. And I think in that context, if you look at voluntary carbon markets and the willingness of various corporate actors and individuals to pay for climate change mitigation at some scale, that's something that needs to be welcomed, not rejected. I can understand to some extent where folks like Greenpeace are coming from, but I think it's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Even $2 billion is something that's significant in the grand scheme of things. And if this market can go to $50 billion, we absolutely ought to try to see it get there. I think the concerns, if I may, are related to what companies and different actors are claiming in conjunction with carbon offsets, and in particular, the concern that they might be foregoing reducing their own emissions and just buying carbon credits, which is probably a mistake. So that's something that needs to be monitored. And then, folks who are familiar with this space may have seen stories about carbon crediting projects where the emission reductions are overestimated, or maybe you're paying for things that were happening anyway. That's been a perennial challenge here, but it's not as if everything out there is flawed in that way. And so that's just something that needs to be paid attention to as well.
Absolutely. And Donna, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, so I agree with everything Derek has said. And as you mentioned, Steve, I've spent most of my career working in and for and around governments, and it is a slow crawl in terms of we are not doing enough and governments aren't taking this on. And I understand, because I worked for a government, how hard it is to enact comprehensive climate legislation, because it impacts the whole economy, right? And so people have to be willing to take that sacrifice, and they aren't. I'll tell you, it is a bruising experience representing the United States in climate change negotiations. I started off in Bush 2 and moved to Obama. And I remember the moment that the Obama administration, our lead climate negotiator, Todd Stearns, said, "We're back." And the whole, thousands of people in the climate negotiations stood up and gave us a standing ovation. Within a couple of years, or very soon, maybe in a year or two, they realized, oh, like the US Congress isn't going to do anything. It is hard to get the kind of policies we need. For that reason, I believe we need every single effort possible. And the fact that companies are coming to the table and making climate commitments and providing the climate finance that Derek talks about, for me, it took me out of retirement. I was going to retire, but I saw, here's this new climate finance. Can we do something to drive more impact with it? Because it is something new and something that can be, one of many things that we need to do to tackle climate change. So here I am, co-founding Calyx Global, hopefully to make sure that the only way this market is going to scale is if there is quality. And so that's what we're trying to do. I hope we can talk about it more today.
Absolutely. We'll get into it in just a minute. And Taylor, I want to give you a chance if there's anything you'd like to add, especially from sort of the buyer perspective.
Yeah, I would say just from a corporate perspective, I have to, echo what Derek was saying. Obviously, we think it's really important that companies be pursuing efforts to reduce their own emissions first before turning to the voluntary carbon market, and carbon credits should not be a way to forestall, those efforts. But we think it's really important that these carbon credits can complement those strategies that corporates are building and help accelerate the overall transition to a lower carbon economy. And so at JP Morgan, we've set a number of targets specifically to reduce our environmental footprint. We have a Scope 1 and Scope 2 location-based emissions reduction target to reduce it by 40% by 2030. And this requires us to make significant investments in our own operations to reduce our emissions at our buildings, branches, and data centers. And we'll continue to prioritize these types of efforts within our operations. But we think that we do have a carbon neutrality commitment that requires us to go out to the market on an annual basis to purchase carbon credits to meet. But we think that this is a fantastic way for us to be supporting the carbon solutions that will be necessary to help the world achieve its climate goals. So, we ultimately think that the voluntary market is a clear way for us to help drive capital towards existing and already scalable solutions that are going to be needed to deliver near-term reductions and removals faster. It can also help generate economic value for reducing emissions and can incentivize innovation to further accelerate decarbonization. And then finally, a lot of these projects have additional co-benefits that will be even more valuable as the impacts of climate change are starting to be felt across the world. So it's just one part of our overall strategy, but we think it's growing in importance.
Awesome. Thank you all. So the topic today obviously is sort of very intentionally to dive further into the nitty-gritty of the markets and get beyond the sort of economist's dream version of carbon offsets where they're sort of a commodity, because there is sort of that idea that carbon offsets should be treated as a commodity like grain or oil. they're measured in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e. An offset, pays a price per ton of carbon. It feels like they should be treated as interchangeable, sort of no matter where the removal or reduction occurs, or the type of greenhouse gas that's removed or reduced. A ton of carbon should be a ton of carbon. Of course, if that were true, the market would be simple. This panel probably wouldn't exist, and we could all take our sort of pastries and coffee and go home. But that's simply not the case. So we want to dig into the specifics of why you all think that stylized version of offsets isn't accurate, and why offsets aren't a commodity. Derek, again, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So I guess when it comes to offsets, they can be deceptively complicated, if I can put it that way. If you look at the challenge, again, from a global perspective, how we need to address climate change globally, there is no silver bullet. To borrow a phrase, we need to do everything everywhere all at once. And there are any number of activities that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's CO2 or methane or other greenhouse gases, or remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And the challenge is that while we need to be pursuing all these options, not all of them make great carbon offsets. So when you're buying a carbon offset, in essence, you're paying someone else to reduce emissions so that you can claim that emission reduction, or claim to have enabled that emission reduction to happen, right? And so for that to be true, carbon offsets need to meet certain criteria, the big one being what we call additionality in the jargon of this field. It basically just means that the emission reductions would not have happened were you or someone else not paying the entity to reduce those emissions, right? And of course, the challenge is there's all kinds of things going on in the absence of carbon credit revenue, that reduce emissions, whether that's energy efficiency improvements or renewable energy, right? We see renewable energy going in gangbusters around the world, which is a great thing, but in a lot of cases, it doesn't need that extra support. And so when you have those kinds of activities, they may be good for the climate, but it's hard to make this case that they're additional. Whereas there are other things like destroying industrial waste gases, which may not be very sexy, but there's no other reason to do them besides getting carbon credits and generating revenue that way. They don't have other revenue streams. They're not required by law. The additionality is pretty sound. And so you have that kind of scale of differentiation. That's the big one. You also need to worry about quantification. So, you're basically counting what the emission reductions are in actuality when you're paying someone to implement these activities, but you have to compare that to what the emissions would have been otherwise, the baseline for these activities. That is subject to uncertainty. There are measurement uncertainties, so those kinds of things need to be addressed. And again, some kinds of activities, the impact is easier to measure and estimate than others. And then the third big one really is this question of permanence, which is really only an issue for some types of activities. But if you're looking at forestry, for example, that takes CO2 out of the atmosphere, or if you're preventing deforestation and the release of CO2 to the atmosphere, that's great, but you need to be careful that that carbon is not just re-released at some point in the future due to fire or human activities, so on and so forth. And so that needs to be taken into account. And it's because there's so much variability across all the different activities that it's, we like to say a ton is a ton, but it's really a bit more nuanced than that.
Thanks, Eric. John, I'll turn to you. I know Calyx has done some really interesting research about sort of project by project quality variability, and tried to look at whether things like project developer or location or type of credit change like sort of the quality analysis or predict it. Like, what did you find when you did that analysis?
Yeah, and we're still doing the analysis, Steve. So Calyx Global is carbon credit ratings agency, and to date we have rated a little over 350 projects. That sounds like a lot, but I think there's over 4,000 that are generating credits right now and some 7,000 that are registered. So it's just the tip of the iceberg, and we've gotten started and we hope to scale over time. But just with the sample, exactly as you say, over across many project types, geographies, different methodologies, project developers, all these different parameters. I guess the short story is what Derek said. There's really high variability. And maybe to your point, Steve, that makes it really hard to think of this as a commodity in which a credit is the same, that there's perfect fungibility. I guess that's what we're trying to do at Calyx, to provide this information to the market about the confidence we have that a ton is a ton, as Derek said. And that's what our ratings represent. Like, how confident can you be that this asset that you're being sold is what it claims, which is a ton of permanent, unique emission reductions that you can own, right? So you can actually go on our website, calyxglobal.com, and there's a blog page, and you can see the distribution of our ratings. And we provide this distribution across different project types. So you can see the distribution of our ratings are from A to E for forests, wastes, industrial gas, which, as Derek said, has high additionality and actually does pretty well in our system. And other types, cook stoves, etc. So we're trying to, over time, provide more information to the public. We want to be more transparent. We're just getting started. I think the market is very nascent, and that's part of what causes this variability, right? The VCM is this odd ecosystem of voluntary actors, right, with no oversight or quality control. It is by definition unregulated, and so it's not so surprising that we see this variability.
Thanks, Donna. Taylor, on your end, since you're an active buyer, I wanted to cover one other sort of challenge or oddity of the market, which is sort of the actual logistics of buying. There's no single one-stop shop like Amazon you can go to buy carbon offsets. So what does it actually look like to figure out who to buy from, where to buy offsets, and how to compare prices and things like that?
Yeah, well, it certainly doesn't feel like your traditional commodity market when you're out trying to find carbon credits, and it really does go back to, there's not the liquidity necessary for efficient trading. So you're starting to see more and more trading desks pop up and different platforms where you can purchase credits, but there's still a lot of work that has to be done from a buyer's perspective to understand what it is that you're getting. Because to Derek and Donna's point, with all of this variability across project types, a ton isn't a ton, and it certainly isn't. When you want to be transparent about the carbon projects you're buying, you want to make sure that you've done your due diligence on a project, and you don't necessarily see the same case when you're buying gold on the commodities market. The expectation is that the gold that you're getting is what it's supposed to be. It's the correct weight, and that should be sufficient. To Donna's point earlier, it doesn't feel fungible at this point. We've already seen in our own purchasing, as we've gotten more sophisticated, that credits that we've purchased in the past we would not purchase again, given what we've learned and how even just the science has improved and evolved over time. So I think as we start to at least rally around a more widely accepted definition of quality, that will help, and that will help bring about some of the more traditional trading infrastructure that can be used to support the further growth of the market. This improved trading infrastructure will ultimately, with things like forward market instruments and reference contracts, bring about additional liquidity, price transparency, and risk management, which I think will contribute to the greater scale and efficiency of the market as a whole. So hopefully there will be clearer ways for market participants like buyers to engage with the market and have a clearer understanding of what they're getting when they do go out and buy a credit.
Thanks, Taylor. That's great. So okay, I think we've come a little ways here. We've established that offsets are pretty clearly not a commodity. In my view, it's sort of unlike any other market I've encountered. The liquidity is low, the opacity is high, price uncertainty is high, quality is variable. But buyers still need to buy successfully in order to harness this powerful tool. So, as part of that, I want to dive into how do you set a strategy for success in this market? As a buyer, you may well be optimizing for multiple things at once. You may want to drive climate impact, You may want, I imagine for most buyers, price is an important input. And you probably want to be able to sort of explain what you're doing and tell your story to key stakeholders, whether that's employees or investors or customers. Taylor, we'll get to actually the nuts and bolts tactics in a moment, but I wanted to start by hearing how you at JP Morgan sort of set strategic goals for your offset buying. You have sort of an amount you want to buy. How do you go from there to actually setting your strategy?
What's interesting is the way that I think about it is there are a couple of challenges, both internally. So as we make the case to continue to buy carbon credits to meet our commitments, as well as externally, just with how quickly the market is evolving, that inform how we build our strategy. So I thought it'd be helpful to just cover a couple of these challenges and how we think about how they inform our approach. So one of the first pieces is there's just a lack of familiarity with carbon projects, how carbon credits work. And there's really not, a place within corporates right now where you have the technical expertise needed to evaluate them. So, this makes it very challenging when you're trying to define a strategy for purchasing carbon credits. How do you set the price that you should be targeting when right now price and quality aren't necessarily correlated. And so for this, one of the things that we've had to do is start to think through our strategy for building a team around this. So we have decided to build some in-house expertise, but the challenge is there's no way we would be able to hire enough technical expertise to evaluate every project that we would need to as part of our portfolio. And so, we've started to leverage tools like the rating agencies like Calyx Global and other technical advisors to support some of this work. So it's a combination. We're both building that expertise internally, but also looking for external resources that are being developed to support buyers in this work, because the expectation is that we're not all scientists on the operational sustainability team, but that we can find the tools to help us make the right decisions. There's also just a lot of uncertainty about the quality of credit still, as we've sort of alluded to, and that rightly so leads to concerns about greenwashing for corporates who want to purchase credits and talk about the work that they're doing. And so, from our perspective, how this informs our approach is we've tried to be better at being more transparent about how we're thinking about this, be really transparent that we don't know everything, that we're trying to stay up to speed with how this market is evolving, and that we know there are no perfect projects out there, but here are the things that we're looking at and evaluating as we go into the market and purchase credits. We think that if we are really clear and upfront about the market challenges more broadly, that will potentially help as we know that there will be continued scrutiny on the market and projects specifically. And then I think another really important thing that we've highlighted earlier in this conversation is corporates need to make sure that this is being paired with emission reduction efforts in their own operations. And so in order to do this credibly, you really do need to make sure that you've respected sort of the mitigation hierarchy and are doing things in-house before turning to the voluntary carbon markets. And then finally, I'll just highlight that there's an increasing cost of building a portfolio of carbon credits, especially as you're looking to identify high quality carbon credits. And so I think that's something that we've had to work really hard at internally, is articulating what that looks like going forward. And it's a bit different for everybody depending on where you're focusing your strategy and the types of credits that you'd like in your portfolio. But generally, establishing that in order to make carbon offsetting or carbon neutrality and net zero claims in the future, it is going to increasingly cost more for corporations to do that. And so if it is a really important part of your strategy, it's important to get that in front of senior leadership now and be really clear and transparent about where we think the market is headed. So those are just a couple of things that have informed the way that we've been thinking about developing our strategy, and ultimately, as we'll get into a little bit more detail later, our approach to sourcing credits in the market today.
Thanks, Taylor. And I should say, like, Taylor's very modest. I think she and her team are probably in the upper 1% of expertise in procuring carbon offsets. So really appreciate that. I do think it is illustrative that even someone in that situation feels like there are challenges, and it's really, really hard to navigate the markets. So turning to you, Donna, I do want to ask, sort of, where have you seen folks sort of go wrong in buying? There may be multiple sort of good strategies, but where have you seen folks adopt strategies that end up problematic from a credit quality perspective?
Yeah. I had to smile when Taylor talks about how it's hard to get expertise, because at Calyx Global, we're only 2 years old. And we rely a lot on me begging and groveling for people like Derek. It's time because he's got like 20 plus years, right? I don't want to date you, Derek, but there are just a few methodology geeks out there who are now like the most popular kids in class. And so I spend a lot of my time and energy trying to get their time. And that's why, we have partners at Sachem Environment and in Frost and Carbon Limits and Climate Focus, because there's just the expertise is hard to find. And it really is a quality difference when you have somebody that's been looking at this market for, a decade or 2 decades or more. So we work really hard to get those people's times. It's interesting when we talk to a lot of companies now, and all of them do want high quality. They want, if they're offsetting, they want to do so with integrity. But then they make choices that get them in the front page of The Guardian or Bloomberg Green. And the question is, how does that happen and why does that happen? And I think it's because right now we have this lack of expertise, but there are also very few neutral arbiters on quality. So if you think about the way the market was, a few years ago, a company would go out to a broker and the broker would tell them, I can tell you what's high quality, right? Or they think about standards. There was a sense a few years ago, well, as long as it's VCS or gold standard or ACR, it's fine, right? That's high quality. But all of these actors or project developers will say like, my project's awesome. Of course they will. All of these actors have a conflict of interest, right? They have a financial stake. They're either getting money directly or as a commission or an issuance fee, right? Standards get paid through issuance fees. So I think that's what we're trying to do, like create an independent, unbiased source of information. But what we do see companies do, because they have this sense like, oh, I can trust a broker, I can trust the standard, that they focused on idiosyncratic preferences, things like what's charismatic, right? So what photo can I put in my sustainability brochure that will be really nice? Maybe some leopards or, a beautiful tropical forest. Or they might buy credits in locations in which they had operations because it could, like, you're purchasing some goodwill in a place that you operate. I talked to a company that just surveyed their employees, like, what kind of credits do you want to buy? But I see this changing, and that is what gives me hope. And I think it's really good. What we see now is we have customers who come to us who say, you know what, our first preference is quality, like help me find the good credits. And only secondarily will we look at these other characteristics. And I think that's just part of the maturing of the market.
Thanks for that, Donna. That's super helpful. And I think, you're exactly right. It'll be really interesting to see how that continues to evolve. One strategy I wanted to talk about in particular, Derek, sort of relates to sort of there being two kinds of carbon offsets broadly, right? There's those that avoid emissions. We talked about them, things like avoided deforestation or sort of capturing methane emitted by landfills, and those that remove carbon from the atmosphere. Think, net new tree planting, mangroves, or things, new engineered solutions like direct air capture. In general, removals tend to be meaningfully more expensive and somewhat less available than avoided emissions offsets. And yet some argue that sort of the only correct strategy for buyers is to purchase removals rather than buying a range of offsets with avoided emissions alongside removals. Derek, would love your take as an expert on whether buyers should be looking only at removals or whether there's quality to be found in avoided emission offsets as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is one of these phenomena that, in the last few years has had those of us who've maybe been around 20 years scratching our heads a little bit. So there's been a surge in demand for removal-based offsets, so much so that I think they're trading at 5 times what the price of avoided emission offsets might be. I don't know, that was from a couple of years ago, but I think it's persisted. Formalistically, I can see the argument, right? The only way to properly compensate for you putting a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere is to take it out again. I think that's the idea that's underlying a lot of this. Some of the blame, I think, can be laid at the feet of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, not to pick on them too much, but their whole approach is based on this idea of addressing the concern that companies might over rely on carbon credits. So they, if you want to be recognized by SBTi, you have to commit to reducing your own emissions or your value chain emissions in line with science-based targets. And for a long time, they basically said no offsets, right? It's not even part of the equation. You just focus on reducing your own emissions. Couple, 3 years ago, it became clear, if it hadn't been clear before, that globally, it's not enough to just reduce our emissions. We're going to have to also take CO2 out of the atmosphere and achieve net zero emissions globally. And so they made some accommodation within SBTi to say, reduce your emissions in line with science-based targets, and then you may also neutralize, that was their term, those emissions with removals. And a lot of folks looked at that and said, oh, it is okay to use offsets, but they have to be removal-based offsets. And I think this was a bit of a category error, I would say. I think, again, going back to, this is my theme for today, like looking at this from a global perspective. Yes, we need to start ramping up removals, but in terms of what's most urgently needed today, we need to reduce emissions. And so if you're thinking of voluntary carbon markets as a kind of piece of global climate finance being mobilized to address climate change, I think there's a strong argument for focusing even primarily on emission reductions, avoided emissions. Maybe some of your portfolio can involve removals, but I think it's important not to get overly rote or formalistic. And as far as the quality is concerned, you do hear some folks argue like maybe the additionality of removals is stronger than it might be for some avoided emission activities. Maybe that's true if you're talking about like direct air capture, carbon storage, these technological based removals with geologic storage that cost $1,000 per ton or something like that. There's no other revenue stream, but it's not true for what I would say the majority of the market is, which is like tree planting. Folks plant trees all the time for things that have nothing to do with carbon revenue. And so that issue is just as salient with a lot of the removal markets as it might be for some avoided emissions. And the inverse, right? There's some avoided emission activities for which the case for additionality is strong. So I wouldn't get too hung up on like there being a quality distinction. Again, I would say look at it from a global perspective. And I think that means a combination of both.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Derek, for that answer. And I'd like to cover sort of one more topic with the panel before sort of opening it up for Q&A. I know we got a late start, of course, so I want to make sure that there's time for that as well. So I think so far we've learned, right, offsets are an important tool. They can have meaningful and real impact. And, as folks have nodded at already, there's some real challenges in the market. One of the largest offset brokers in the world just faced some criticism for overstating the impact of their flagship project in Zimbabwe. We've talked about how renewables may not be as additional as they once were, as the cost of things like wind and solar have come down. There's a nod to the Guardian article, which reported that a significant number of REDD+ projects may not be delivering on their promise. That isn't great, right? The buyers of those offsets didn't really get what they paid for, and the public may, begin to lose some confidence in the markets, which is what we can sort of least afford at the moment we're at. There are lots of things we can continue to do to improve the perception of the markets. The ICVCM that Derek and Donna are involved in is a great example of that as sort of the policy level. But I want to focus for now on the concrete aspects of sort of being a buyer. What should buyers do to be confident in this environment where there's lots of things floating around? You have good aims, but you want to land it and sort of make your efforts drive real impact. Taylor, let's start with you, because you are sort of like the prominent buyer on this panel, right? And I would love to walk through like the nuts and bolts of your buying process. Like, what does it look like as you evaluate projects and figure out whether they're a yes or no on buying?
Sure. Well, so I'll just say, first of all, JP Morgan has been buying carbon credits since 2008. So we've had a long time to learn in this environment and to learn from the mistakes that we made. We've definitely, used to have some of those pitfalls that Donna called out of, thinking that if we buy in the areas where we operate, or, we definitely were more favorable towards the charismatic credits, forestry credits, because they have a great story to tell. But as the market has evolved and there's obviously a much more robust conversation around quality and more scrutiny at, on the project level, it's become really important for us to take a more thoughtful approach to how we do this. So I would say over the last couple of years, we used to procure our credits through a broker. So we would basically come up with a list of high level criteria. Again, a lot of the buzzwords, or jargon that Derek threw out earlier around additionality and permanence and these things that, we knew you were supposed to look for, but didn't really fully understand how to evaluate. Then we'd get a list of credits back and we'd go through the list and we'd do some, relatively high level due diligence, meaning, with the tools that we have, which is Googling, using some of the negative media searches that we have internally, but it was very, very limited. And so as I mentioned, we've spent a lot more time thinking about this. We've hired some internal expertise to help us build out this process. And, being a bank, risk management is one of the things we're really good at. And so we've leveraged partners across the firm on our risk teams within legal, compliance, our credit risk groups to start to think through how should we be evaluating these projects more in a more holistic way. And one of the things we found, and I'll talk through the process step by step, but one of the things we found is we can't do it by ourselves. We don't have the right internal expertise to do that. And so we've added in a couple of key pieces to the process that leverage external expertise. So, there's no shortage of projects that come across our desks. So we get inundated with project developers who want to sell JP Morgan their credits. And so once we've had sort of that initial conversation, taking a look at their, what their projects are, and generally they meet the high level criteria that we've set out for our, we've decided some certain things are important to our portfolio to have in our portfolio. And so if it checks those general boxes and, they have the, relative volume and price that we're looking for, we'll continue down the road with them. And then we do our own internal, what we call our own internal technical review, which is taking a deeper look at the registry methodology, the project documentation, project ratings from organizations like Calyx, and any additional documentation that we've collected from the project developer to do our own initial assessment and see if we find any red flags in our own review. Once we've done that, we start the expert socialization. So we have found, we have a number of different ways that we do this, and it's sort of dependent on the project type and the level of external expertise that we feel like we need. But we have found advisors in this space to bring in, depending on the project type, to give us advice on what types of things we need to be looking for, to do some of the more, scientific and technical analyses of the projects that we may not, have the skill set internally to do ourselves. We think this is pretty important. Again, we have found a number of times after we've done our own review that we weren't able to identify all of the issues that came up in a project. So it's important to find these resources and to supplement your process, especially in the early phases of sort of strengthening your due diligence. Don't hesitate to leverage external resources. And then, as I mentioned, we utilize a lot of our internal resources. So again, being a bank, we have gotten pretty good at evaluating risk. And so we've outlined a number of risk categories that we're evaluating for: financial risk, delivery risk, technology risk, reputational risk of these projects. And we have tools that we use to try to evaluate, what level of risk we're taking on by engaging with this project. And our decision making around whether or not we want to move forward will be somewhat dependent on the type of contract that we're doing. So if we're prepaying 100% upfront, well, that's a very different, assessment of risk than if we're paying upon delivery of those credits. And then finally, we have, different processes we use to socialize transactions with senior leadership. And so again, because the voluntary carbon market is so in the news right now, it's important to make sure that folks, as we're executing these transactions, are aware and that they are brought up to speed and well educated on the work that was done to due diligence these projects before making a decision, and ultimately, that they're supportive and make sure that everybody's aligned on the broader strategy before we go out and are transparent about the purchases that we've made. So it's come a long way. There's a lot more steps. It takes a lot more time to execute these transactions. We no longer do this once a year. We used to basically wait until our inventory was done and buy in the first quarter of the following year. In order to be able to secure enough of the credits that we're looking for, we purchase credits on a rolling basis, and we're looking more and more to execute long-term contracts to make sure that we can access supply, but also to get some price favorability, as we do believe that the price of the credits will continue to go up. So that's another piece of the strategy that's evolved a bit, just as the market itself has changed.
Thanks, Taylor. That's super helpful and super detailed, like about the tactics and sort of in the weeds pieces that I think a lot of folks don't often talk about in these conversations. So I really appreciate your sharing some of that. Donna, I think would love to, get your take, on like your dream scenario of how folks should be using ratings agencies, whether that's to sort of like standardize misperceptions across different types of projects or as an initial cut or something else. Like how do you think people should use Calyx and its peers?
That's a really great question. And I don't know that it's a single way in which our ratings and data and information can be used. What we find when we work with companies is they span the gamut from shops like JP Morgan, who have built up all this experience over, sounds like a decade and a half. And so we're just maybe one piece of input, right, to their full due diligence process. That's on one end of the spectrum, and that's partly because Taylor and her team have so much already in internal process and expertise. To the other side, which is companies that will just say, well, we just want to buy an A or B rated credit from Calyx and sort of just trust the process. Either way is fine for us. I think we're happy if we have any impact on the decision making, right? That's all we're trying to do, is to drive higher impact. I think what's important in terms of ratings agencies is that we are and remain free from a conflict of interest, as I said before. So we will not, as a ratings agency, and we have been asked by many project developers, for example, like, can you help us to make sure that as we build this project, we're doing so in a way that will get a good rating? And we always say no, because we're not going to dispense advice or data or information to a project and then rate them on the back end, right? It's really important for us that our ratings also, there's just no financial connection between our ratings and the way that we generate revenue. So this conflict of interest, I think, is really important. Things that I find are really surprising right now, and you sort of hinted at this, Steve, is that they're currently, for us, we don't see a huge correlation between price and quality, especially in terms of greenhouse gas integrity. There is a correlation with SDG or sustainable development impact, these co-benefits, right? Which really speaks to this charisma and the storytelling and that piece that still exists in the market. But oftentimes those credits that have the great stories have really nice SDG ratings. So we do the SDG ratings and there's a correlation there, but they have some weaknesses on the emission reductions claim. And so if they're used for offsetting, right, it's different if a company is making a contribution claim from making an offsetting carbon neutral net zero type claim. That's where we see these news articles popping up. And that's where you get sort of this reputational risk. And that's what we hope to help companies think about, right? If you're going to use this to compensate for an emission, what are the risks there? I will say the final thing is that we call them the ugly ducklings. Like, I think what we hope to do is to share with the market that there are some really good credits out there that are underpriced and underappreciated that we feel, and they're fit for purpose, as Derek said, like they're the type of mitigation activity that can meet these quality criteria. They're more low-hanging fruit. And we really like to show our customers that they exist. We wrote a blog about landfill gas, and as we did so, I was looking for a photo. Like, can I get a photo of this landfill gas project? It's really hard to find. Like any nature-based project, there are so many photos on the internet, and I actually had a really hard time finding this. And so we wrote this blog called Wasted Potential, hashtag trash can make a difference. And we hope to really point the market to some of these underappreciated project types.
Thanks, Donna. One of my favorite days here involved an email exchange with you back and forth about the relative qualities of various Turkish landfill gas projects over a time period. So it's always fun to nerd out with you on that. I am grateful that so much of our audience has stuck with us over as we've run a bit long. So I want to leave time for some Q&A. I think in our current setup, that means sort of raising your hand. Mark, my co-founder who's in the room, will call on you and then sort of share the question with our panelists here.
Yeah, the way we'll work it is if you all can, as I call on you, want to state your question, I'll repeat it for the group on camera. Why don't we start in the front row there? Offsets today are not a commodity market, but is it desirable for it to end up being such as the case with oil today?
I think Derek, you might have. I see you smiling, so I think you might have something to say on that one. You want to take that one?
Yeah, it's a little hard to answer because, yeah, I guess, as background here, like both Donna and I sit on the expert panel for the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which started out as the task force for scaling voluntary carbon markets. And one of their original objectives, sort of parallel to raising the integrity of the market, was to also turn carbon credits into more of a commodity and build some of that market architecture around that. And I can see, like, if you want to scale these up and create more liquidity, I could scale these markets up. I can see the argument for that. At the same time, I think a lot of buyers aren't necessarily looking for a commodity, right or wrong. You heard what Donna was saying about folks maybe focusing on the wrong things. But I think that the co-benefits, the sustainable development benefits often are just as important, or they're still very important. And so it's a little hard to commoditize, notwithstanding just what I was saying about the nature of carbon credits, and just you have so many different types of mitigation activities that it's difficult to really ensure that you have ton for ton across like the additionality and quantification and permanence criteria. Maybe movement somewhat in that direction, but I think it's probably more important just to focus on trying to shore up the integrity of a lot of the credits that are out there while still preserving some of the differentiation, because again, it's a varied market.
I saw another question up to the left. Great, thanks for the question. So we have a question from a founder of an urban forestry company, and she's looking at the different ratings agencies out there. And do you have any recommendations on basic actions to take to make sure that they're developing good projects?
Donna, I think this maybe could be directed at you, which is to say, I think if I understand the question correctly, is like, if you're a project developer, what should you be focused on upfront to make sure that your project rating will end up being in a good place on the back end?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And what we hope to do as a ratings agency is start to put out more and more information about, for us, like, what are we looking for as a ratings agency to give a project a really high score? So we did this recently for one project type, which is RED, or reducing emissions from deforestation. And we hope to do it over the coming months. Follow us on LinkedIn, because we'll announce when we dribble out this information, right? Because as we're slowly building and looking at different project types, we will be providing public information, and partly for project developers, because we want to be fair, right? It's unfair to just have like a black box rating, to really tell people what is it that we're looking for. We do have a generic document called Calyx Ratings Explained, and I think all the ratings agencies, I hope, over time, and the others do as well, and they're even a little bit further ahead of us, start really being transparent about what are those characteristics, what are the parameters, what is the data, like how are we doing these ratings. So you can see our first gambit at this with the red report that we released, but we will be doing more of these over time to provide that transparent information.
Right. Let's take one last question. Great. This is a question specifically for Taylor or anybody else who wants to weigh in, but around the question of reputational risk with regards to carbon markets, does that pose a challenge to growing the market over time? May that lead to the overall market stagnating?
I definitely think it is a challenge. Obviously, corporates are one of the largest participants in the voluntary carbon market, and reputation risk is a factor that we consider in a lot of most decisions that we make. And so I do think when negative media comes out and sort of wholesale criticizes the voluntary carbon market, that does spook people. But I think one of the things that's important for corporates to think about as they're engaging in this market, and I mentioned, I touched on a little bit earlier, is, be really transparent about the way that you're engaging in the market. Because, while we've acknowledged that there are challenges and some of the negative or the criticism of the market is it's founded. It should, the criticism is correct. But if you are articulating that, this is the approach that you're taking, you're trying to be really thoughtful, you've leveraged various resources to help inform your decision making, and that, if you get it wrong, you'll continue to learn, you'll follow the science as it evolves, and you'll tweak your strategy going forward. So I think for us and other corporates, not trying to shy away when negative media comes out or there's broader criticism of the market. And obviously, not everybody will take that approach. So I think there is still that risk that as the market sort of sorts some of these things out, that there are little hiccups there where people pull back. But I think, again, we're moving towards a more common definition of what quality is. And I think that will also help where, corporates feel more confident and comfortable in participating in the market once they, there is a sort of standard for quality that they can feel good about and start to understand how they can achieve that within their own portfolio.
Thanks, Taylor. Since we are out of time, I just want to close sort of by restating, at the highest level, what I think we've established and what we certainly believe at CNOT, sort of bolstered by what we've learned from experts like the folks here. The first is that offsets are, a critical tool in any future where we keep global temperatures from rising beyond where they're headed right now. And second, in order to unlock the kind of adoption and impact that will drive the scale that we need in the markets, the market has to become easier to navigate. I'm energized every day because at CNOT, our team gets to work on solving exactly that problem. We think we've come up with a way to sort of solve for the conflict of interest issues that Donna flagged and make access to affordable and high quality offsets easier for every buyer. So of course, if anyone wants to chat with us about CNOT, Mark, my co-founder, and I will be available after the event. For now, I just want to close by thanking our panelists again for their time today, and thank our audience and our panelists for joining us and for your patience with the technical challenges up front. I hope everyone has a great rest of San Francisco Climate Week and rest of your day. Thank you.